It's really good to be with all of you again. And if this is your first time, we are changing tack a little bit from the journey we've been taking through the fundamental beliefs of our church. We're going to move today from the fundamental to the foundational. Fiaz, doesn't seem like my clicker is working. There we go. We've been looking at what we believe the Bible teaches us about God, about ourselves, about our world, about our past, about our present, and about our future. But I wanted to just take a step back because sometimes we can get too hung up in the middle of doctrine and the different beliefs and forget the most foundational aspect of choosing to follow Christ. So as I said, if this is your first time, you'll be able to pick right up and engage with this message, whether you're here in person or online, and we really appreciate all of those of you who are able to connect with us online as well. What we're going to talk about, this thing that's so foundational, is something that amazed Jesus. Just think about that for a second. I know it's harder and harder for us to be amazed these days. I mean, you go to YouTube and there's this big title, "You'll be amazed at what happens next." And by this stage, I'm like, will I? Will I be amazed that a 1-year-old little girl can recite 30 F1 drivers? Will I be amazed that your cat can sing Eye of the Tiger while playing the bass at the same time? Will I really be amazed at the taxi that actually stops at the stop street? Actually, I will. It's harder and harder for us who've seen everything to be amazed. Imagine for Jesus, who made everything. What does it take to amaze Jesus? In the Gospels and Acts, the word amazed, the Greek word amazed, which can also be translated as marveled or wondered, is used 38 times. And 36 of those times, it's as human beings, our wonder and marvel at Jesus. The shepherds marvel at this angel choir that comes to tell them about the Messiah born in a manger. The disciples marvel at the power of a man who can stand up in a boat in the middle of a storm and command peace. Crowds are amazed at the authority with which Jesus teaches. Everyone is amazed that the lame walk, the blind see, the dumb speak, and the deaf hear, as Jesus extends his miraculous healing powers wherever he goes. Pilate is amazed at this man who stands calmly and silently before him when there's a crowd baying for his blood. All of those things we understand as sources of amazement. But yet, 2 of the times that amazement is described in the Gospels, Jesus is the one who is amazed. We're going to look at those 2 stories. The first is the centurion in Capernaum, and the second is Jesus' neighbors in Nazareth. Let's go to Matthew chapter 8, and let's meet the centurion. Jesus has just finished preaching the most famous sermon ever preached, on the Sermon on the Mount, where he lays out the manifesto of his kingdom. And then he travels into Capernaum. And as he comes into Capernaum, a centurion came to him, asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home, paralyzed and suffering terribly." Not just anyone becomes a centurion. In order to become the leader of 100 other soldiers, You needed to demonstrate your prowess, your competence at Roman martial arts. You needed to prove your bravery, how tough you were, how you could stand up to any size army as your enemy, how you could lead from the front other men into battle. Being a Roman centurion also meant that you grew up believing in all kinds of gods, vengeful gods who blessed or cursed depending on their capricious moods or on your sacrifices to them. A very different upbringing than you'd expect for someone who ended up having great faith in Jesus. The Roman centurion didn't spend his childhood watching VeggieTales and going to Adventure Club. He came from a very different place. He comes to Jesus because his servant, and in some translations, it could be seen as his son or someone he greatly loves, is lying at home, paralyzed and suffering terribly. Jesus says to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replies, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. But just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. And that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." Let's travel to Nazareth and let me just finish this part. Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. And Matthew goes on to write how Jesus next heals one of his followers, Peter's mother-in-law, and he goes throughout the town of Capernaum, healing everybody. And this is to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities, and he bore our diseases. Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy. And he marvels. He's amazed at the faith displayed by this Roman centurion. In our second story, we go to the Gospel of Mark, and it describes how during his ministry, Jesus comes back to his hometown of Nazareth, where he'd grown up. He'd spent 30 years living in the little town of Nazareth, working as a carpenter before he leaves and begins his ministry. It's Sabbath, and Jesus begins to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that's been given him? What are these remarkable miracles that he's performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. That happened so quickly. They marvel at his miracles and the teachings, and now they're offended by him. He could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few people who were ill and heal them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. So what is this foundational concept that Jesus is amazed by? Jesus is amazed in both cases, in both stories, the centurion in Capernaum and the neighbors in Nazareth. Jesus is amazed by faith. And at first glance, it seems like what amazes Jesus is the presence, in one case, in the case of the centurion, and the absence, in the case of his neighbors in Nazareth, of faith. It seems that what impresses Jesus about the centurion's faith is how much faith he has, where he says, you don't even have to come to my home. Just say the word. I understand how authority works. And it seems that what Jesus marvels at, is amazed by, amongst the people that he grew up with, people who have seen and heard his miracles and have heard him teach, by their absence or their lack of faith. But I'd like to ask you to consider this afternoon that when it comes to faith, it's not about how much we have or how little we have. It's not about how much knowledge we have. It's not about how much tithe we give, how often we come to church. Our faith, which is a way of describing how we walk through the world, how we relate to God, how much God impacts our life. When it comes to faith, it's the object or the location of our faith that makes the difference. You see, Jesus was a centurion because here was a man, one of the last people you would expect to have faith in this itinerant preacher, this Jew, this member of the occupied nation that the Roman Empire ruled over. Someone who was used to giving orders without question. What amazed Jesus was that someone like that could place his faith not in his own power and position and wealth and abilities, but place his faith in Jesus. And on the flip side of that, Jesus was amazed that the people who should have known better, who knew him, who could see the change, this little boy that used to play on the streets of Nazareth, the miracles he was performing, the truth that he was sharing in his teachings, who had the background and the prophecies of Isaiah, of someone who would come and take on the infirmities and heal the diseases. And when they saw this thing happening right in front of them, they had no faith in him. They had faith in themselves. And that is our challenge. That is our battle. It's not about how much or how little faith you have. It's all about where is your faith located? What is the object of your faith? Do we rely on ourselves? Do we rely on our preconceived ideas of what God wants for us and for the world? Or are we prepared to replace ourselves from the throne of our lives and place Jesus there and put our faith in him? Because then you see, it doesn't matter how much or how little faith we have. It matters that our faith is in the King of the universe. Jesus tried to explain this concept to his disciples by using an illustration. Back then, before we knew about atoms and had microscopes, etc., one of the smallest things that everyone was familiar with was a mustard seed, a millimeter in diameter, a tiny seed. And Jesus says to his disciples, after a couple of faith failures that they had had, failure to drive out a demon, failure to have enough faith to forgive as much as God calls us to forgive, he says, if you had faith, even as small as a mustard seed, you'd be able to tell a mountain, and this was another common saying of the day, to describe something really impossible. You could tell a mountain to jump up and go and throw itself in the sea. Jesus wasn't saying that if we can just start to believe a little bit, a tiny amount of faith, we'll be able to do these amazing things. The point Jesus is getting across is if our faith faith is located in the right place. That's what matters. The Bible is full of stories of the great men of faith who did mighty things, and each one of them had times when their faith failed. Because it's not about how much faith we can muster. It's where is that faith located. And each failure is preempted by taking our faith away from God and placing it in ourselves or in others around us. Where is your faith located? Paul, whose faith was located in his historical lineage, his great learning at the feet of the most brilliant professors and experts of his time, who wrote most of the New Testament, writes in the book of Hebrews, through his own experience of having to take the faith that he had placed in all of those things, his Jewishness, his learnedness, and place it in the Jesus Christ that he met on the road to Damascus. This is how he describes faith. He says, without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So for us, as a working definition of faith, from the two stories we've read through together and from the description that Paul gives us, I would say today that faith is living like Jesus is who he says he is and does what he says he does. Faith is living, factoring into every decision we make the fact that Jesus is who he says he is and he does what he says he does. The centurion came with his faith to Jesus because he believed that Jesus is who he says he is. He said, I understand how authority works. I have authority over 100 soldiers. I'm part of the Roman Empire, which has authority over the known world. But I recognize that you are who you say you are. You are the king of the universe. And so your authority extends everywhere. And that's why I know that you can heal my servant right here. You don't have to come to my house because your authority is already there. You are who you say you are, and you will do what you say you will do. His neighbors in Nazareth, on the other hand, refused to accept that Jesus was who he said he was. And therefore, as we read, Jesus was constrained in Nazareth. He couldn't do the miracles that he did in other places. Only a few people who believed and placed their faith in him were saved. Faith is living like Jesus is who he says he is and does what he says he does. So how let's get to the application. How practically can we ensure that we place our faith in the right place? The first step is to have humility. Like the centurion of Capernaum, who didn't stand on his power and position, but accepted that he wasn't worthy to have Jesus come and spend time with him, he exhibited humility. He accepted Jesus' authority. And faith, when it's placed in the right place, works because it's other-centered. He focused not on asking for what he asked for himself, but for someone who was suffering, for his servant. Have humility, accept authority, and focus on others. Focus on friends. And focus on friends works in two ways. It means an other-centered focus when our faith is in God, but it also means that the people that we surround ourselves with, if they also have placed their faith in God, it strengthens our faith. It encourages us to keep our faith in God, and not to be tempted to place our faith in ourselves at all. Now imagine as a church, what we can do together to make sure our faith is located in God, that Jesus is the object of our faith, that we don't become self-reliant and self-satisfied with what we achieve and what we have and the resources at our disposal. And as a church, and not just our church, but this is the purpose of church, of the ecclesia that Jesus encouraged his followers to establish. We need practical teaching. How will we know who Jesus says he is unless we come together and we listen to sermons, we study the Bible together? Practical teaching which delivers truth and tells us who Jesus is. Then we can place our faith in him. Personal ministry. A church encourages us not just to work on our own relationship and connection with God, but to foster that connection by ministering to other people, by being involved in some way in enriching and helping each other to place our faith in God. Private disciplines, spending time in prayer, in ensuring our connection with God is strong, making sure that we stay humble, that we cultivate generosity and hospitality, that we let God's word direct the choices that we make. And then providential relationships. God is a relational God. He knows that what we do together with his power is way more powerful than anything that we could do on our own. And he's placed in our lives, each of us, relationships, connections with other people that strengthen our faith, that affirm that our faith should be placed in God and in Jesus alone. I'd like to just share with you a very short experience that we've had this last week. And you'll see each of those elements come up in that story. Each of the elements: practical teaching, personal ministry, private disciplines, and providential relationships. Some of you may recognize this. If you drive into Solari's Pass village, there's the three-way stop. If you turn right, you go over the railway line, through Rusterkamp, up the hill, and you can get back onto the N2. Last winter, the big storms, this little settlement to the left called Eight Cake was completely flooded. This is the remains of Mildred Rank's home, and we'll call her Tannie Millie, because Millie is a much nicer name than Mildred, right? Since last winter, Tannie Millie has been living a few nights here, a few nights there, as other families take her in. She's the granny of the little community of Eight Cake. She's the one that walks the kids to school in the morning and back home in the afternoon and looks after them until those parents who do have work come home from work. And through a providential relationship, a connection that started with Noni and Elizabeth Fasahi, and then I got drawn in and I brought in another providential relationship and a personal ministry, the men's group that Ian and Carla started some time ago. And I said, we've got to have a project, something for us men to do. And so with prayer and with some planning, one thing led to another, and Elizabeth took me to Solari's Pass and said, we need a house for Tannie Millie. And I was like, I totally agree, we need a house for Tannie Millie. I'm sure someone who knows how to build houses will do something for Tannie Millie. Because yeah. Well, we looked around. She got permission from the city of Cape Town to build on this site, to erect a temporary shelter. We found somebody who could build a house for the budget that we had, and it went up. Beginning of this week, I had no idea we'd be building a house for Tani Millie. It's budget time at work. I've got contracts to negotiate. I've got a team to motivate. There was limited time and attention, and I didn't think we would do it. Because why? Because my faith was only in myself. My faith was in my abilities, my time, my resources, my friends. We came to the point where we placed our faith in God. Organized things for Wednesday, and then heard that Wednesday was going to be pouring with rain. But God came through. Wednesday was the perfect building day. Not a drop of rain fell, but it was overcast and cool the whole day while the build happened. And from Wednesday night, Tani Millie slept in her own house. Not because of anything we could do in our own resources, but because we were prepared to put our faith in God. And what I'd like to challenge all of you is, ask yourself, where is your faith located? Don't waste time thinking about, I've got such little faith. So-and-so has such great faith. Just choose where you put your faith. And can you imagine, as more and more of us start doing that, and as we encourage each other to start doing that, can you imagine? You will be amazed at what happens next. Amen.